Hello, welcome to the video. As some of you might be aware, we saw the passing of Richard Ellis in 2024. Throughout his life he published several notable books, such as The Search for the Giant Squid, Monsters of the Sea, and Sharks: A Visual History. According to his Goodreads page, he published at least 29 different books. One of his books I actually got in 2024, that being Sea Dragons: Predators of the Prehistoric Oceans, published in 2003 and focused on ancient marine reptiles. I will admit I haven't read through the whole thing, but it's definitely been interesting to skim through. A little pricey at times to get a physical copy, yes, and even though there are newer books available, I still like it since it does have a lot of info crammed into it. I originally wanted to publish this video in 2023, but lost interest while working on it. Later on, after his death, and the fact he wrote the first book widely available to the public of this century on marine reptiles, I thought it'd be best to finally finish this video on Mosasaurs. I have also enlisted the help of several other YouTubers I've either interviewed or are good friends with to narrate different chapters of this video. I am responsible for writing and researching the script. These people are only the narrators, so do keep that in mind when giving any criticisms of this video based on the information presented. With that out of the way, I hope you enjoy this video and find it informative.
Before covering natural history, biology, and cryptozoology, we must first define what a mosasaur is for the general viewer. First part to get out of the way is that mosasaurs aren't aquatic dinosaurs. Apart from some genre like Spinosaurus, there's not many known semi-aquatic non-avian dinosaurs, and none of them known were fully aquatic. In a video from the American Museum of Natural History, they explain further that in the reptile family tree, there's two main branches, the Archosaurs and the Lepidosaurs. Dinosaurs belong to the Archosaur side, while mosasaurs belong to the Lepidosaur side, specifically the Squamata order of Lepidosaurs. Modern day bird species are actually living dinosaurs. Meanwhile, the closest living relatives to mosasaurs aren't birds, but instead are other squamates in the form of monitor lizards and snakes. According to Darren Naish in his book Ancient Sea Reptiles, Plesiosaurs, Ichthyosaurs, Mosasaurs, and More, there's been arguments over which is closer, snakes or monitor lizards. For a long time, dating back to the 17 to 1800s with George Cuvier, it's been seen that monitor lizards are the closest. According to Naish, at first glance the skulls of the monitors and mosasaurs look similar, which lead to them being placed in the suborder Anguiomorpha with monitors. However, upon closer inspection, the similarities appear more superficial and could have occurred through convergent evolution. According to Ocean Life in the Time of Dinosaurs, paleontologist Edward Drinker Cope in the 1800s believed that snakes and mosasaurs shared enough similarities he put mosasaurs in a clade he dubbed Pythonomorpha. According to Darren Naish, from the 1990s onward, some experts have argued that snakes are the closest relatives of mosasaurs rather than monitor lizards. An interesting element of their possible snake relationship is that DNA evidence suggests snakes might be their own lineage in Squamata distinct from Anguiomorpha. This could mean mosasaurs might not be within Anguiomorpha if they are most closely related to snakes than monitor lizards. There's also a possibility that they aren't related to monitors or snakes, and that they might have originated in the Jurassic from the same ancestors as geckos, skinks, and anguiomorphs. New papers are constantly published on this subject, so don't be surprised if this video section becomes outdated in several months. With mosasaur relationships out of the way, let's look at the inner workings of Mosasauria. You see, when most hear mosasaur, they think of the genus Mosasaurus, most likely the 12-meter long species Mosasaurus hoffmanni. However, while Mosasaurus hoffmanni is a mosasaur, not all mosasaurs are Mosasaurus hoffmanni. For gun nuts, think of it like how shotguns are guns, but not all guns are shotguns. Mosasaur can be used to refer to any animal within the clade Mosasauria. Listing off the clades recognized in Gregory Paul's 2022 book, The Princeton Field Guide to Mesozoic Sea Reptiles, there is Mosasauroidea, Aegialosauridae, Mosasauridae, Russellosaurinia, Tethysaurinea, Daguerreosaurinae, Tylosaurinae, Plioplatycarpinae, Mosasaurina, Haleosaurinae, Mosasaurinae, Cladastini, and Mosasaurini. I apologize if I butchered any of those. Calvin likes big words. Other mosasaur species you might see in media include the genus Tylosaurus, which has appeared in just as much media as Mosasaurus. Tylosaurus is in the subfamily Tylosaurinae, while Mosasaurus is in Mosasaurinae. While both are in Mosasauridae, there is a split between them in their evolution, and both have had multiple different species recognized and still do. More and more mosasaur genre and species are always being discovered, so don't be surprised if more clades pop up in the coming decades.
Mosasaurus in human history goes back a long, long time. The first discovery of Mosasaurus goes back all the way to the 1700s. When exactly in the 1700s appears to differ depending on the source you actually read, to the point that Calvin found himself confused at times. All the books he had read agreed that the first specimen was a set of jaws and was found in a limestone mine in the Netherlands near Maastricht. But the date is contradicted depending on the source. Nathalie Bardet and Jean Jat, I cannot pronounce his name, I apologize, in 1996 state it to have been found between 1770 and 1774. Darren Naish, in Ancient Sea Reptiles, says sometime in the 1770s, and that it's now on display in Paris's Natural History Museum. Sea Dragons by Richard Ellis states 1772 on page 195, but the description for an illustration on the very next page says 1780. There is also this quote from the Oceans of Kansas's website, which says, new information in his recent book, Mulder, from 2003, reported that the first mosasaur skull, somewhat less complete than the type specimen of Mosasaurus hoffmanni mantell 1829, was actually discovered in 1766 near St. Petersburg, Maastricht, and is still on exhibit in the Teylers Museum in Haarlem. Mulder also noted that the specimen of Mosasaurus hoffmanni, described above, was actually found between 1770 and 1774, not 1780, and was never actually owned by Dr. Hoffmann. According to Mulder, the Canyon Godding was the first legal owner. Hoffmann, however, was the first person who corresponded with other scientists of the day and who got the attention of Camper and Cuvier. End quote. And Oceans of Kansas, the second edition, published in 2017, it keeps the date as 1780, although states a second specimen was found several years before, but never received any attention. While the holotype got attention thanks to the military doctor J.L. Hoffmann, Ocean's Life in the Time of Dinosaurs tells something similar with different dates. The 2021 book states the first mosasaur documented was discovered in 1774, but a set of jaws had been found before in 1770. You can see these dates are getting tossed all over the place. They are now on display at the Teylers Museum in Haarlem, in the Netherlands. Using the dates from Ocean's Life in Time of Dinosaurs, the 1774 specimen would later fall into the hands of the French in November of 1794. In the spring of 1795, it would make its way into the collections of France's Museum of Natural History in Paris, where it still resides to this very day. Known as Maastricht Unknown, naturalists of the time were quite interested to know what the 1774 specimen was. Some said a sperm whale. Others said a crocodile. George Cuvier would receive letters from one A.G. Camper who pointed out similarities between modern varanid lizards and Maastricht Unknown. So there's similars between these. I can never pronounce varanid, I apologize. Cuvier would write the first comprehensive description of what he called the great fossil animal of Maastricht in 1808. In 1822, the fossils would be given the genus name of Mosasaurus by W.D. Conybeare, but wouldn't get the actual species name Hoffmanni from Gideon Mantell until 1829. The full name, Mosasaurus hoffmanni, means Hoffmann's lizard of the River Meuse, referencing both the man who called scientists' attention to the fossil and a river in the Netherlands near the Maastricht. For some, these fossils were quite a curious find. Some believed these fossils, alongside ones from other marine reptiles like ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, were relics from the Great Flood of the Bible. Others thought these bones represent animals that are alive but have yet to be found. Because no one believed in the extinction due to strong religious belief, God wouldn't let his creations die out. According to an episode of Monsters Resurrected titled T-Rex of the Deep, One person even believed the type specimen for Mosasaurus hoffmanni at the French Museum of Natural History actually represented the remains of a dragon killed by a medieval knight. Calvin watched an entire episode of Monsters Resurrected for this single video. He is definitely very, very mentally stable. And moving on from that, according to Darren Naish, Europe's mosasaur deposits weren't properly recognized until paleontologist Louis Dollo described several species from Belgium in the 1880s and 1890s. A little earlier in the United States, in the 1860s and 1880s, American fossil finders had started evacuating fossils of their own from New Jersey and Kansas chalk deposits. This was thanks, in part, to the paleontologists Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh, who are still starting to become reoccurring characters on this channel, and I am assuming that they will stay that for a very long time. And while Marsh and Cope helped to discover and document numerous specimens of Mosasaurus, Samuel Wilston wrote in the 1890s that 4/5 of all known mosasaurs at the time had to be thrown out. This was because of very poor descriptions and interpretations on Cope and Marsh's part, due to their rush to name more species of fossil animals than each other, competing against each other for fossils. Unbelievable. This was annoying for paleontologists of the time, and their taxonomic lunacy was still being sorted out decades after both Marsh and Cope had died. While the taxonomy part is annoying, we can at least thank both of them for supplying so many mosasaur specimens. According to Mike Everhart, Kansas alone had uncovered over 1,000 mosasaur specimens of varying states of preservation. In 1911, a very famous Tylosaurus specimen was discovered, known as the Bunker mosasaur, named after lead discoverer C.D. Bunker. Despite him and his men not being very experienced in excavating fossils, Bunker and his men did their best to unearth and store away every single bone they could get of the Bunker mosasaur. The specimen now hangs in the entryway of the Natural History Museum of Kansas University, descending in a very S-like shape. In 1829, Major Benjamin O'Fallon's found a mosasaur fossil between Fort Lookout and Fort Pierre near the Great Bend of the Missouri River in South Dakota. Prince Maximilian of Weed later bought it from O'Fallon, who had it in his garden in St. Louis in 1845. A German paleontologist named August Goldfuss named it Mosasaurus maxillani after Maximilian. I can never pronounce these. I swear these are so complicated sometimes. 15 years beforehand, in 1830, the tip of the snout of a fossil skull was described as Ichthyosaurus missourianus, believed to be an ichthyosaur. The man who described it originally later had walked back that identification and believed it to have been from a mosasaur instead. The fun part about this little story is that the skull for the Mosasaurus maxillani holotype was missing the very tip of its snout, while the Ichthyosaurus missourianus, I cannot pronounce that, jeez, only had the tip of a snout as a holotype. It is currently believed that the snout tip is most likely from the M. maxillani holotype, and since then, two have become synonymized to become Mosasaurus missourianus. Whatever. Interesting case is that the Mosasaurus from Calvin's home country of Australia, something you probably haven't heard of unless you're a mosasaur enthusiast. Mosasaurs are believed to have had a global distribution, but Australian mosasaurs are hardly talked about, and probably for understandable reasons. Quoting an Australian Geographic article, it says this group was one of the last to appear, not arriving until the inland sea retreated, and only known from the late Cretaceous rocks in WA, Australia, has remains of two different-sized mosasaurs that belonged to two both known groups, but the fossils are not complete enough to be described as species. The fragmentary remains offer tantalizing hints about what is yet to be discovered. And end that quote, first discovered remains of Mosasaurus in Australia came in 1960, according to a 2005 paper by B.P. Keir and J.A. Long and J.E. Martin. The fragmentary remains of forelimbs found have affinities with Platycarpus, and based on Platycarpus, wouldn't belong to a 2.6 meter long animal. Another species would come in the form of 3 associated caudal vertebrae, which, they stated, belonged to a 6 to 8 meter long mosasaur. The authors conclude their paper by saying that the fossil record of Mosasaurus in Australia is too poorly known to be definitive, but it adds an interesting chapter to the group's global distribution. Australia right now is mainly known for its plesiosaurs like Umunosaurus and Carnotaurus, so it'd be interesting to see if the future fossil excavations can turn up anything else in the way of mosasaur remains. More mosasaurs have also been found in Asia, Africa, South America, and Antarctica. In 2023, news headlines ran with a mosasaur from North America being named after the world serpent from Norse mythology, fitting for a group of animals often referred to as real-life sea serpents. The 2012 lecture of The Tale by Mosasaur stated that at the time there was 60 species of mosasaurs that were recognized, and that number has only grown since 2012.
Mosasaurs were around for roughly 25 or more million years. According to Mosasaur by Paolo Fagone, mosasaurs descended from terrestrial lizards known as Aegialosaurs. These animals were around 1 or 2 meters long and named after Aegialosaurus, found in Croatia. There is some debate about if mosasaurs originated from Aegialosaurs, however, with some believing they came from Dolichiosaurs. But it is believed ancestors of mosasaurs were at least similar in design. Papers are always published on this subject also, so this can change in the future. Over time, whatever they evolved from, mosasaurs would evolve traits in order to better handle marine conditions. One of these traits was going from a plesiopelvic to a hydropelvic condition. A plesiopelvic condition is where the pelvic girdle is meant more for weight bearing, while hydropelvic condition is where it has transitioned to become a non-weight bearing element of the body. Aegialosaurs have the plesiopelvic condition, with later, more advanced mosasaurs having the hydropelvic condition. According to Darren Naish, the possibility exists of different mosasaur lineages having evolved this several times independently of one another. Throughout their evolution, mosasaurs developed more phalanges or finger bones. While humans have 3 phalanges in their fingers and 2 in their thumb, mosasaurs evolved several times as many. Feel free to find a photo of a mosasaur flipper and count how many there are. Paolo Fagone showcases mosasaurs in chapter 2 of his book as being a case of Cope's rule of evolution. Cope's rule dictates that in animal lineages, there is a steady increase in body size. The cat family, for example, has origins with genre like Proilurus, which weighed around 9 kilograms or nearly 20 pounds. In the modern day, large forms like lions and tigers, who can both surpass 250 kilograms in body weight or weigh about 551 pounds, have evolved. However, also like the cat family, not every later form of mosasaur was huge. Small, more advanced forms had also evolved later in mosasaur evolution, although given large forms of mosasaurs did come along later in evolutionary history, they weren't the worst example of Cope's rule. The tail of mosasaurs also became gradually more flattened and developed a tail fluke, which resembled an upside-down shark's tail. Michael Everhart believes some early mosasaur forms would have lacked this fluke. There's also evidence that some mosasaurs also had dorsal fins on their backs, showing these guys were becoming very specialized for marine life. Mosasaurs, over their evolution, slowly expanded outwards, and by the time they went extinct, had achieved a global distribution. According to Darren Naish's Ancient Sea Reptiles, some marine ecosystems had a minimum of 10 mosasaur species from several lineages. Some of these mosasaurs were more like their classic ancient Leviathan depictions of a gigantic 12-meter-long animal that was the apex of its ecosystem. Others fitted the not as popular small or medium-sized predator that probably would have been occasional prey for the larger mosasaurs. This made mosasaurs extremely adaptable and able to fill in a lot of different niches, with some, like the genus Globidens, even developing teeth designed to break through the hard shells of armored prey items. Others would have preferred softer prey, while some were generalists in their morphology. The natural history of mosasaurs would be capped off with their extinction 66 million years ago, which will be talked about later in this video.
Mosasaurs are often showcased as long, snake or eel-like in build, being very thin, flexible, and dubbed the real-life serpents. However, this was not the case. Mosasaurs had wide rib cages to accommodate lungs due to them being air breathers, and their bodies overall were fairly stiff. The last third or so of the tail was angled downwards, with a tail fluke protruding from the top of it, forming an upside-down shark's tail. Mosasaurs were dedicated to life in the water, to the point that the only way that they would have been more specialized is if they somehow evolved gills. Mosasaurs are even believed to have been warm-blooded or ectothermic by some researchers. Reasoning for this comes from the temperature of some ancient ecosystems, like the Western Interior Seaway, which would have been too cold for cold-blooded marine reptiles. Unlike some other marine forms with terrestrial origins, mosasaurs kept all four limbs, with these limbs becoming specialized over time in each mosasaur clade, to be designed for balance and stability. Depending on the genus you're looking at, the degree of movement in the limbs differs, with some having better movement than others. Regardless, mosasaurs, especially the big genera like the Mosasaurus and Tylosaurus, wouldn't have been able to crawl onto land. They most likely would have suffered the same fate as whales that get beached. Danish proposed that perhaps some mosasaurs had hunting behaviors like killer whales, that being sliding up to the shoreline and back into the water. But of course, this is just speculation. Mosasaur jaws feature what is known as pterygoid teeth. Teeth that are on the roof of the mouth designed to hold struggling prey, separate from the teeth along the edges of the upper and lower jaws. Mosasaur jaws were also flexible, having a hinge point in the middle of the bottom jaw, and the front of their bottom jaw wasn't fixed with bone, but rather flexible ligaments. This allowed their jaws to open wide in order to swallow large chunks of food. This is similar to the anatomy of snakes, which also feature pterygoid teeth and ligaments holding their jaws together. Speaking of snakes, an interesting piece of speculation when it comes to mosasaurs is if they were venomous. Danish, in Ancient Sea Reptiles, speculates mosasaurs might have been venomous due to this close relationship to monitor lizards and snakes. Venomous snakes have venom glands in the roof of their mouths that inject the venom into the animal's body, using two front fangs. Monitor lizards are often said to have a toxic bite because of the bacteria from scavenging rotten meat. However, it has been confirmed that monitors like the Australian lace monitor and the Indonesian Komodo dragon are in fact venomous. Their venom glands, unlike snakes, are in the lower jaw and seeps into their saliva via openings near the base of their teeth. If mosasaurs were venomous, they probably had the latter form of venom gland anatomy. But it does beg the question of exactly how effective the anatomical setup would be underwater. Perhaps mosasaurs were originally venomous but lost their venom as they became more specialized for a water lifestyle, if their venom wasn't effective. If it was effective underwater, then it would be hard to prove its existence given this would be soft tissue. Given that they were predators, it appears that as far back as the 1980s, it was recognized exactly how mosasaurs hunted. According to Richard Ellis's book, Sea Dragons, mosasaurs had multiple adaptations for fast acceleration, which is an indication that mosasaurs were designed as short-ranged ambush predators, similar to terrestrial big cats. This can be seen in the documentary series Prehistoric Planet, where a mosasaur is shown waiting at the ocean floor for a plesiosaur to swim past before it rushes up from beneath, hitting it with its open jaws. The genus known as Tylosaurus has an interesting feature which might have helped it in hunting as well. The end of its snout, called the rostrum, protrudes quite far beyond the teeth, which some have speculated could have been used as a battering ram to stun or cripple prey. Something similar is seen in modern-day killer whales, although killer whales also use other parts of their body like tail flukes and can be choosy about what prey they ram. Some genera, like Globidens, had crushing teeth for dealing with hard-shell prey, while others had more piercing teeth for this job. In the 1980s, paleontologist Judy Messer recognized different forms of teeth along marine reptiles and actually placed them into different categories, which will be shown on screen. Some of these forms were designed for eating squishy prey items, others more heavily armored prey, and even varied depending on the size of prey in question. Some mosasaur fossils, like those of Tylosaurus, have on occasion been found with bone pathologies, giving indication of them getting the bends, which is caused by rising up to the surface too fast. This indicates that some mosasaurs, like Tylosaurs, were most likely deep-diving animals, or at the very least would dive down far enough for this to occur. Other mosasaurs haven't had the same pathologies found, or possess adaptations showing that they were more surface-dwelling animals. Some mosasaurs had also invaded estuaries and rivers. It appears that mosasaurs' global range was in fact truly global.
Alright fellas, you ready? We're on to size here. This is perhaps the best part of the video. And you know what? When it comes to size, mosasaurs were incredibly diverse, ranging from the small forms like Dilophosaurus turneri, all the way up to the creature that she tells you not to worry about, like the Tylosaurus prorigger and the Mosasaurus hoffmanni. And you know what? I kind of wonder this, and feel free to comment your opinions as well, but who would win in a fight between a Mosasaurus hoffmanni and a megalodon? Let's start that debate in the comments. Anyways, since both the Mosasaurus hoffmanni and the Tylosaurus prorigger were really big, this brings up the question of just how big were the largest mosasaurs. Going off Mesozoic sea reptiles, the three largest mosasaur species were the following: Tylosaurus prorigger at 13 meters and about 6.5 metric tons, the Plotosaurus benisoni at 13 meters and about 6 metric tons, and of course the famous Mosasaurus hoffmanni at 13 meters and 5.5 metric tons. And you know what? All these guys crossed about the 5 metric ton mark, and being about 13 meters long makes them longer than modern day orcas, but overall lighter. According to the book Sea Mammals, male orcas can weigh up to a whopping 10 metric tons and reach about 10 meters in length. Now those are the big boys of the orca world, but the average male orca is more or less around the 6-ton mark. So this actually makes the mosasaurs and tylosaurs pretty impressive when it comes to size. Anyways, I digress. In the book Sea Dragons, Richard Ellis has a quote from Dave Martill and Darren Neisch about the pliosaur Liapleurodon in the book Walking with Dinosaurs: The Evidence. How did they know about that? They stated that scientists can't really simply place whales on a scale, kind of obvious, and they use various other methods to estimate size, which can range greatly, with a lot of weight coming from the blubber/fat. The blubber is mainly used for long-term migrations and to insulate whales from being in the freezing cold. Liapleurodon was a warm water creature, meaning that it most likely wouldn't have the need to actually develop large amounts of blubber. So according to Martel and Neisch, even if the pliosaur could reach about blue whale lengths, it wouldn't really have the same weight. While blubber really hasn't been confirmed on mosasaurs, what Martel and Neisch apply to Liapleurodon could also ring true for mosasaurs in tropical versus Arctic climates. But regardless, some larger estimates actually do exist for mosasaurs beyond Gregory Paul's book. Ellis also wrote the famous book Bunker Tylosaur. The Bunker Mosasaur, according to Ellis, might have weighed as much as 8 US tons, making it 550 kilograms larger than Paul's lists for Tylosaurus prorigger. Yeah, that's a big boy, but even larger estimates do exist, so don't be surprised to find numbers higher than 10 metric tons for larger mosasaur species. Okay, now keep in mind that for later on in this video, okay? Now, in terms of length, larger numbers, again, do exist for mosasaurs. Mike Everhart and their colleagues, after seeing the very big 60-meter-long mosasaur in Jurassic World, would write about mosasaur sizes. They state that some fairly large mosasaur specimens, such as the Penza mosasaur specimen from Russia, according to them, is about 17 meters long. Yeah, pretty big fella as well. Now get this, okay? A Belgian mosasaur known as Tylosaurus bernardi also has been estimated to be about 17 to 17.5 meters, and that the Tylosaurus prorigger was only about 15.8 meters by the early Campanian, basing it off the Bunker mosasaur. Now, in the oceans of Kansas, Everhart stated that Mosasaurs would have continually grown through their life, although kind of slowing down the growth rate as the animal got older. Now, even though he mentions the chances of us finding the largest specimen of any species is impossible, Everhart believes that the largest of these animals would have likely gone up to 20 meters in length. However, of course, there might be some problems with the size estimates. Remember, humans like to exaggerate size, so it's really not uncommon that it could be mistranslated. According to the Wikipedia article from Mosasaurus, Dale Russell stated that in his famous 1967 work on mosasaurs, that the length of their jaw was almost about 1/10 of their entire body length. However, no justification was actually given for the 1:10 ratio. According to the same page, a 2014 study argued that based on a prognathodon specimen, that the body length was 7 times the skull length, or about 1:8. This has sadly led to smaller estimates for the mosasaurs overall. In the Guinness Book of World Records, for instance, it recognizes the Tylosaurus pemminensis specimen, also known as Bruce, to be the longest mosasaur on display, at roughly 13 meters. Okay, now, contrary to the Guinness World Records, this might not actually be the longest. While Everhart in his Oceans of Kansas website lists 12 meters, and Richard Ellis says just roughly over 15 meters, according to Kansas University Biodiversity Institute and the Natural History Museum, yeah, fun name to say by the way, the bunker mosasaur is roughly 13.5 meters. Okay, now one thing Calvin did find interesting about the bunker mosasaur is that while Richard Ellis lists a longer length of 50 feet or just over 15 meters in length, he says that the skull is around 6 feet long, or nearly 1.8 meters. Using the skull length and the 1:8 ratio, we get a length of about 48 feet. Okay, now using the 1:10 scaling, or 18.3 meters. Now assuming the true size is actually in the middle, the bunker mosasaur would be around 54 feet long, or just about 16.5 meters. Alright, now those are some pretty large specimens, don't get me wrong, but one experiment Calvin was interested in doing when it comes to scaling these animals was comparing them to modern day sharks. Specifically, the big three, also known as the bull shark, the tiger shark, and the great white shark. Now, going off the data from the Florida Museum, bulls reach about 340 centimeters, tigers reached about 550 centimeters, and great whites reached about 600 centimeters. From here, Calvin came across a DeviantArt profile from the user Rymasuchus. In the post, he includes a table of different weights and length estimates, using the skull-to-body ratio of 1:10 and 1:9. He labeled the 1:10 as max and the 1:9 as a minimum. Rymasuchus lists the averages to be about 1,300 centimeters minimum and 450 centimeters at max, which is based on his calculations. Yeah, those are some pretty big estimates. Now, taking the data and actually applying the percentages from the big three sharks, we can get a hypothetical maximum for size for the Mosasaurus hoffmanni. The results were about 2,171 centimeters from bulls, 2,500 centimeters from tigers, and 1,650 centimeters from the great whites. Now, those estimates were from the minimum size that Rymasuchus lists. For the max, he gets 2,412 centimeters from bulls, 2,782 centimeters from tigers, and 1,837 centimeters from great whites. Now, given that going off the tiger sharks, there could have been a nearly 28-meter long mosasaur? Yeah, not really. And this should have been seen as just a little bit of a thought experiment. If this is actually the disparity between the averages and the largest modern marine predators, what were the past ones like? Just because someone does a calculation does not mean it's valid, okay? Yeah, some may actually point out that the ratios that Rymasuchus used to get the sizes of the 1:10 and the 1:9, according to Rymasuchus, mosasaurs had a comparatively smaller skull compared to other mosasaurs, so kind of justifying the 1:10 ratio in his eyes. In this post, the largest specimen Rymasuchus estimated was a fragmentary specimen known as NHMM 603092. Yeah, that's a long name. Honestly, we really need to find a better way to actually name specimens. specimens, but I digress. He estimates a 2,700 centimeter and 4,700 kilogram minimum. At a max, he places these specimens at just under 6,500 kilograms and 2,300 centimeters. So at 23 meters and close to 65 metric tons, yeah, this mosasaur would have been larger than several whales living today if that is true. Now obviously you will find some naysayers who doubt this size. Calvin does as well, since you can't really just trust everything you see on the internet. However, the same specimen would have still been very massive. If we went to the 1:8 ratio, we'd still get a monstrous 18.4 meters. But this is just still a fragmentary specimen. Now one thing Calvin did find interesting was that after writing this part of the script, a DeviantArt user known as Harry the Fox, who wrote in relation to the reconstruction of the user Dragon of Mosasaurus hoffmanni. Dragon, as he is referred to, places his reconstruction of about 13 meters. According to Harry the Fox, this is actually too small to be placed at 15 meters. Point of interest is a section in Harry's post, where he talks about the curved back, and also how the last part of the tail vertebrae column was angled down. This means that in a straight line between pegs, the animal may have measured 15 meters, but if you were to straighten out its tail and back, it would theoretically be longer. Yeah, so maybe the 1:10 ratio actually relies on the skeleton being straight, when in actuality that is not the case in real life. You know, the back of mosasaurs are actually curved to match their rounded stomach. Okay, but Calvin did wonder this. With the curved back and tail shortening the total length, what if he scaled the largest fragmentary specimen Rhymasuchus lists off of Harry the Fox's reconstruction? If it is truly 15 meters with a curved back and angled tail, and has a 1.7 meter long jaw, well, 15 divided by 1.7 meters equals a result of about 8.77. So the result when actually applying that to the specimen is a length of about 2,017 centimeters. Again, this particular specimen is fragmentary, so any estimates for it or other fragmentary specimens should be taken with a grain of salt. Now, in conclusion on mosasaur size, these guys were probably larger at max than some people may believe. But for now, regardless if they were 12 meters or 30 meters, they were still large, and their size has helped cement them as real-life sea serpents.
The topic of reproduction was a mystery for a long time. Williston and other paleontologists of their time had the idea in mind that these animals crawled up on land to lay eggs, despite their anatomy saying otherwise. Given that the anatomy shows they were locked to the water, as shown in the anatomy section, Darren Naish described mosasaurs crawling onto land to lay eggs as like whales crawling onto land to give birth. This later led to the theory emerging that rather than laying eggs, mosasaurs gave birth to live, fully developed young. Evidence comes from mosasaur remains found with developing embryos. Some of these young within their mother are positioned so the tail comes out first, a feature that is common in animals that give live birth in water. Live birth has been confirmed in plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs, meaning that it's not a stretch to say mosasaurs would have been live bearers as well. In 2020, there was a paper published on an egg roughly 29 centimeters, or 11.5 inches in diameter, found in upper Cretaceous sediments of Antarctica. Due to it possessing some features characteristic of squamates, the idea was proposed it was a mosasaur egg. However, Darren Naish finds it unlikely and states it most likely came from another reptile, with him stating, quote, perhaps a pterosaur. Some early paleontologists believed that infant mosasaurs lived in estuaries or nearshore environments that would have offered protection due to infant mosasaur remains not being found with adult mosasaurs. However, according to Everhart, a 2015 study analyzing collections from the Yale Peabody Museum had found multiple neonate mosasaur specimens misidentified as toothed birds. This, according to Everhart, helped show that mosasaurs of all ages lived and died in the Western Interior Seaway. According to Everhart, some of these mosasaurs were giving birth more than 200 miles, or 321.8 kilometers, from the nearest land based on multiple of these specimens being found in the Smoky Hill Chalk of Kansas. This also brings up some interesting aspects about mosasaur behavior. So far, not much is known, with the traditional view of them as solitary territorial animals, with some evidence for this being a mosasaur skull found with bite marks that line up perfectly with mosasaur teeth. However, modern relatives of mosasaurs can be social on occasion, with Mike Everhart speculating that females might have been social animals that grew up to protect their young. This would be beneficial given that these animals lived in an ecosystem with some steep competition, such as the Ginsu shark, aka Cretoxyrina manteli, plesiosaurs, and other mosasaur species. Everhart does also theorize that young mosasaurs might have hidden out in floating seaweed patches, but he states that there isn't any evidence to back up large seaweed clumps floating around the Western Interior Seaway. Whatever way mosasaurs reproduced and however they grew to adulthood, whatever they did was effective enough to help them go from bottom of the food chain to the top of it in a relatively quick amount of geologic time.
Roughly 66 million years ago, an asteroid would hit the Earth, which famously wiped out the dinosaurs, pterosaurs, plesiosaurs, mosasaurs, and several other animal lineages. For a long time, there has been great debate about whether or not mosasaurs were already on their way out before the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction event, or were at their peak in diversity. According to Oceans of Kansas, in the coniation stage of the Cretaceous period, around 85.8 to 89 million years ago, there came the first wave mosasaurs in the western interior seaway. These included genera like Tylosaurs, Cladastes, and Plesioplecarpus. By the Campanian stage, 71.3 to 83.5 million years ago, there was a second wave of evolutionary diversity, including Tylosaurs or Hanosaurus bernardi, Mosasaurs, Globodons, Plioplacarpus, and Prognathodon. By the time of the Maastrichtian stage, 66 to 71.3 million years ago, mosasaurs were at their peak in diversity and distribution, including moving into freshwater habitats, with what Everhart called the beginning of the third wave of mosasaurs. Darren Naish, in Ancient Sea Reptiles, states that some marine ecosystems had a minimum of 10 species of mosasaurs from several different lineages on the mosasaur family tree. According to Pilo Fagon's book on mosasaurs, the extinction of large marine reptiles was a strange event, given how diverse and common they were across the world. Fagon states a possible cause for this might have been the higher acidity in the ocean, affecting ammonites, which in turn affected top predators, and from there, other marine animals. While the scientific consensus is that mosasaurs went extinct in the KPG extinction, this hasn't stopped some people of varying levels of credibility and notability in the field of cryptozoology from speculating on their continued existence.
Two staples of cryptozoology are the lake monster and the sea serpent. Think the Loch Ness Monster, Gloucester sea serpent, Cadborosaurus, and others. One of the most notable books from the father of cryptozoology, Bernard Heuvelmans, is In the Wake of the Sea Serpents. Originally published in 1965, this book is a 650-page behemoth of close to 600 reported sightings of sea monsters across the world. A book this big, published before the internet, shows how much material there is on sea serpents. Now, you may be aware of plesiosaurs being put forward as candidates for some of these reported creatures. However, some have suggested that living mosasaurs may be behind some cryptids as well. But first, one of the most well-known fake mosasaur sightings came from a Jurassic World marketing campaign. They made videos showing the InGen dinosaurs, now roaming the world, interacting with their newfound habitat. One of these videos was of the Mosasaurus swimming past an offshore platform. USA Today later published an article fact-checking a version of the video that was going around claiming to show proof that mosasaurs were still alive. While they were right in saying that it wasn't a living mosasaur video, they also said that mosasaurs were close relatives of whales and dolphins, which isn't right. Moving on from that, there is the Carnival Cruise monster, a mosasaur-like animal reported to the controversial Max Hawthorne. For those who don't know who Max Hawthorne is, he's mainly known as a fiction writer, popular for his Chronos Rising series of books. In the world of paleontology and cryptozoology, however, he's also been known for some controversy. He's reportedly claimed to have fossils in his collection showing that Prognathodon could reach over 80 feet in length and weigh over 76 tons. He's also claimed to have solved the mystery of how plesiosaurs swam, something people already did before him years ago. He's also a proponent of the controversial theory that adult megalodons were scavengers. Back to the Carnival cruise monster. According to the first article Hawthorne posted, the man who reported this to him, Paul George, was on a ship called the Carnival Breeze in 2014. While cruising from Miami, Florida to Mexico, George saw people gathering towards the ship's port side and went over to see what was going on. He then saw a large animal trailing behind the boat, which he guessed was approximately 50 feet long, with the head, which he described as being like a crocodile's, being about 10 feet long. George believes he only saw a portion of the animal, and that it would have been far larger in total size. He described it as being dark gray or black in color, with lines running down its back. George claimed to have gotten some photos on a phone, however he has since lost the phone containing the images, making them lost media. Hawthorne asked if George knew anyone else who might have taken photos, and George replied saying that all people who saw it, as far as he was aware, didn't have their phones on them. After a lot of back and forth with George, Hawthorne would send him several sketches he made of a top-down view of the monster's profile based on the vague description George gave him. George said the one labeled E looked the most similar, but George later sent him a sketch where the neck and head looked way different. To be fair to George, he did say he sucked at drawing. Hawthorne would later make some edits to George's sketch. Hawthorne came under the impression that the broad shoulders George saw were in fact flippers, noting water disturbances around the creature in the sketch, and George agreed. Hawthorne also told George that a pliosaur of the proportions shown would be, according to him, around 80 feet or 25 meters in length, and that a mosasaur would be even longer. He also states that whalers have reported seeing mosasaurs or mosasaur-like animals estimated to be about 100 to 120 feet long. Two friends of Hawthorne, paleo artist Andrew Cox and Walt Disney animator Jason Zucker, also made their own illustrations of the creature. Some theories thrown around online are it being a new or unidentified species of whale, a rock or similar surface feature, a living mosasaur, a saltwater crocodile, a possibly living basilosaurus, and a fabricated story. The last explanation seems the most likely. Hawthorne isn't considered to be very credible, and he says towards the end of his first article on the animal that it's reminiscent of a scene from one of his novels. Perhaps he just tweaked a story he wrote into something more realistic and published it as a reported animal sighting. If it was a fabrication on his end, Hawthorne could have made this a little more credible if he showed screenshots of text messages in his articles rather than just transcripts of them. Nobody has found this Paul George guy yet, and it is a very common name, so it seems that this was just a stunt to promote his books, or something he just did for fun. It's worth mentioning too that, even if the animal is real, it's probably not as big as Hawthorne thinks it is, given water can magnify size by 25%, and the animal was underwater for most of the sighting. Another example you might be aware of is the story of Shark Alpha, a 2.7 meter long female great white shark that was tagged and then reportedly eaten by some giant marine monster. According to Hawthorne, the animal dived from out near the surface to around 610 meters deep in the Bremer Canyon. Diving down is usually a tactic great white sharks use when they're in danger. The temperature, according to the tag, jumped from roughly 7.8 degrees Celsius to 25.6 degrees. The tag hung around between the surface and 300 feet, or 91 meters, for roughly 8 days, before later being found washed up on a beach. Trace amounts of stomach acid were also found on the tag. Some online have claimed that it was simply a large great white shark, others saying it was a living megalodon. Hawthorne, however, concluded that it was a large marine reptile. He wrote at the end of his first article about Shark Alpha, "Conclusion: Shark Alpha was eaten by a large marine reptile. Possible candidates include a giant mosasaur or plesiosaur, or an undocumented species of huge, piscivorous sea turtle." The sea turtle one is the theory Hawthorne later expanded upon in a second article, but giant sea turtles can wait for their own video. In 2019, Hawthorne would upload a video to YouTube going over a short video from the Carcharodon carcharius Facebook page. The video shows two orcas off of the coast of Norway, one male and one female, with the female being the main focus. She is shown to be extremely malnourished and features several injuries, including what appears to be bite marks on her side and a chunk taken out of her right pectoral fin. Hawthorne makes several comparisons with orcas, sperm whales, sharks, and squid bite marks, with all of them, according to him, not matching. Based on the shape of the bites, Hawthorne concluded that what we are looking at is the bite from some sort of unknown marine animal, with him thinking of a mosasaur. While there are some similarities he points out between the bite marks and mosasaur jaws that make it interesting, a living mosasaur is quite extreme. It'd be more likely to say it was an unknown predator, rather than a species that's been extinct for tens of millions of years. Although science is about understanding the world and getting to the bottom of things, sometimes there's a point where all we can say is, we don't know for sure. While there's always a small chance of animals thought to be extinct still being alive, even the megalodon would probably have a better chance of being alive than mosasaurs. These supposed living mosasaurs being a new species is more logical than mosasaurs surviving all these years. Either that, or they are misidentified animals already recognized by science. Darren Naish wrote a post for his tetrapod zoology blog on the animal known as the Migo monster, which a Japanese newspaper claimed was a living mosasaur. After analyzing the footage of the supposed Migo, Darren identified it as most likely being a large saltwater crocodile. One thing you notice when you go through mosasaur sightings is that there is a long history of hoaxes and twisting of stories. As an example, you have the August 1889 sighting by the ship the Rotomahana. They reported seeing a large eel-like creature in the water roughly 100 yards away. The captain speculated about 30 feet, or roughly 9 meters of the creature was out of the water, with him imagining there being an extra 2/3 under the water. He also described it as having flippers. While overestimation is common, taking this at face value, the creature would have been around blue whale size in length. Although it was said to have flippers, the description of an eel with large flippers doesn't match up with a mosasaur at all. Another example is the Taniwas of New Zealand, with New Zealand overall being a sort of hotspot for alleged mosasaur sightings. Taniwas are reportedly animals of Maori mythology and tradition. However, some believe they are based on real animals, with one of these theorized animals being mosasaurs. There's a report from the 1920s that describes a creature said to have a long neck and fierce-looking teeth. This description sounds less like a mosasaur and more like a plesiosaur. One of the worst offenders of twisted mosasaur stories comes from a Japanese fishing vessel in 1971. According to some, it spotted a mosasaur-like animal. However, the YouTuber Wild World uncovered the original report, which described a hippo-like animal. The story was probably influenced by the basking shark carcass dragged up by the Zuyomaru that people thought was a plesiosaur around the same time. There's also the case of a man named Ivan Levy who, in 2006, was reportedly attacked by two 6-meter-long mosasaur-like animals in New Zealand. His boat allegedly sustained a beating from these creatures for an hour. It seems like this was a new twist on an old story. Cryptid researcher Bamias pointed out how in 1919, there was a man named Ivan Levy supposedly attacked by a moa. From there, the name Ivan Levy became sort of a gag character for people in New Zealand. There's also a claim that Alan Marks, a paleontologist, said that there was a population of mosasaurs living in New Zealand waters. The YouTuber Wild World dug around and found no Alan Marks who were paleontologists or had any relationship with mosasaurs in New Zealand. As you can see, many supposedly promising sightings and evidence turns out to be either hoaxes or something that was twisted in some way. Possibly the most famous of the marine saurian category of cryptids is the legendary U-28 monster. As the story goes, the U-28, a German U-boat, sunk the British cargo ship Iberian. After a minute or so, a loud explosion happened underwater, and a large creature was launched out of the water into the air. It was said to resemble a crocodile, but was about 60 feet or 18 meters long. It reportedly hung in the air for about 10 to 15 seconds before falling back into the water. There have been a lot of theories about this sighting, like the Iberian having a crocodile on board as a secret cargo. However, the most outlandish and unlikely theory is that it was a living mosasaur. For starters, the creature was described as having webbed feet, not fins. Mosasaur don't have webbed feet, but fully developed fins. Old crocodile-like depictions of mosasaurs are likely inaccurate, because mosasaurs are relatives of monitor lizards and snakes, whose teeth are covered by gums and lips. The captain of the U-28, George Forstner, only reported this sighting in 1933, while the sinking of the Iberian happened in 1915. 1933 is also the same year that the Loch Ness Monster began being popularized. With this in mind, it seems that Forstner could have made up the event. Some details support this, like Forstner reporting that he had estimated the Iberian sunk to a depth of about 500 fathoms, which is around 3,000 feet or 900 meters. This would seem alright, until you realize that he said this occurred over a short period of 25 seconds after torpedoing the ship. According to Carl Schuker, this equals to the speed of the ship being 90 miles an hour, or about 145 kilometers an hour. Highway speed in Australia is 110 kilometers an hour for comparison. It's hard to believe that the ship sunk so quickly it could get a speeding ticket in Australia. Schuker also mentioned that cryptozoological researcher Ulrich Magen found nothing on the U-28 monster in local Irish newspapers that also reported the Iberian being sunk. One of them would publish articles on an unrelated sea monster sighting a week later, but nothing on the U-28 monster. Schuker also brings up another reported sea serpent, also from 1915, from a U-boat called the U-20. The sea serpent was spotted at 10 p.m. and was said to have a long head like a crocodile and was estimated to be 90 feet or 27 meters long. Given the year both sightings occurred, both ships being German U-boats, and Forstner's delay in telling the story, it appears that Forstner's story was probably a fabrication. Forstner may have even tried to cash in on the Loch Ness Monster's fame. Another possible case of a hoaxed mosasaur sighting comes from Captain Jason Seabury's sea serpent sighting of 1852. Captain Seabury was on his ship, the Monongahela, in the Atlantic Ocean when he sighted white foam. They thought it was a whale at first, until they saw how huge the animal was. Longboats were sent out and they harpooned the creature. After a long struggle, they eventually killed the creature. They brought the creature's body alongside the ship to attempt to process it like they would process a whale. The animal was reportedly a male that was black in color with a white stripe and a total length of over 107 feet and 9 inches. It had fins described as lumps of hard loose flesh, a firm cartilage tail, blowholes like a whale, and, according to Max Hawthorne, one of the animal's lungs was larger than the other. This last trait is a characteristic of snakes. The animal also had a 4-inch layer of blubber, which, when turned into oil, was clear in color and burnt nearly as fast as turpentine. Hawthorne noted that these details were very interesting, given the one lung being smaller than the other and the firm cartilage tail. Mosasaurs had only entered the public mind a few decades before this. Our understanding of mosasaurs was nothing like what it was today, with tail flukes and affinities with snakes, which possibly adds some credibility to the report. However, there are a lot of problems with this sighting. First off, it was documented that the ship had taken bones from the animal alongside an eye that was preserved in a vat of liquor. This brings up the question of, where are the body parts? Well, it's believed that the Monongahela got lost and sunk sometime in 1853. Any physical evidence of the animal, if it existed, is lost to time until that wreck is found. The only evidence of this story that exists is a letter that Seabury supposedly gave to Captain Sturges of the whaling ship Gypsy, which had encountered them sometime after they killed the sea serpent. The Anomaly Info website points out that there was no Captain Sturges in charge of the Gypsy, which could point towards this story being a hoax. Alternatively, that could have just been the name of someone on board, and they just weren't the captain. According to an article from the Oceans of Kansas website, given the enlarged nature of chest cavities of mosasaurs, they probably had 2 functional lungs, rather than 1 like some snake species have. Some snake species have 2, it's just that 1 is small and vestigial. This means that the supposed mosasaur would have probably had to evolve smaller lungs, which wouldn't make much sense for an animal that needs to hold its breath underwater. It's worth noting how many diverse species of mosasaurs there are, as explained earlier in the video. According to Ancient Sea Reptiles by Darren Naish, some marine ecosystems across the late Cretaceous had 10 or more mosasaur species from several lineages. Given how quickly mosasaurs went from underdogs to top dogs in their ecosystem, it's hard to see them not making a comeback after the KPG if they survived. As a result, scientists probably would have found a lot of fossils of younger mosasaurs if they did make it past the mass extinction. Given how mosasaurs weren't limited to large forms like Tylosaurus, we probably would have found some smaller forms as well. A smaller mosasaurus, not the 100-foot behemoth some sightings describe, would be better adapted to survive mass extinctions where food was more rare. Overall, it seems quite implausible right now for there to be mosasaurs alive today. If these sightings are actually people seeing a giant marine reptile, it's probably a new species and not a living mosasaur. The YouTube channel Wild World also uploaded a video dedicated to the subject of post-Cretaceous mosasaurs. If you want a massive 25-minute long video on the subject, check out that video after watching this. Consider this a companion to that video.
In conclusion on this video, while I believe the undisputed king of marine predators are the sharks, given how they have been around for over 450 million years, mosasaurs are still impressive animals. The clade brought forth the largest squamates and possibly some of the largest marine reptiles besides the absurdly large ichthyosaurs like Ichthyotitan. They appeared in the fossil record and rapidly and effectively adapted to a new marine environment, facing off against large sharks, other marine reptiles, and God knows what else. Given how rapidly they diversified to fill multiple niches from the bottom to the top, it makes one wonder what would have happened if the KPG extinction never happened. While they didn't last as long as plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs, the mosasaurs were mighty in their own right, and while they have joined those 2 groups as extinct animals, they have carved their own place in human culture, ranging from challenging religious dogma that animals can in fact go extinct, to being put forth as an identity for the biblical Leviathan. Mosasaurs were the ultimate sea serpents of prehistoric times. If you liked this video, please make sure to like, share and subscribe, and I'll see you next time I upload.